Hey everyone, tonight we ease into the hauntingly theatrical descent of Napoleon Bonaparte, the self-crowned titan who conquered Europe one over-ambitious idea at a time. His life, a mashup of battlefields, betrayals, badly timed comebacks, and the kind of love letters that read like emotionally unstable opera librettos. So before you get too comfortable, hit that like button, maybe subscribe if you're into ego-driven emperors with chronic overcompensation and the tragic poetry of hubris. Also drop in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time zone you're defying for this. It's always fun to watch empires fall with international company. Dim the lights, let your tea steep, and let's descend together into the smoke-filled glory and downfall of a man who once ruled most of Europe and still couldn't rule his own liver. Emperor of everything and other problems. Napoleon Bonaparte didn't stumble onto the world stage. He marched onto it in boots so polished they reflected his own ambition back at him. Born on a small island in the Mediterranean, he made sure the world would never mistake him for small again. Corsica gave him his accent, France gave him his opportunity, and history gave him the chance to become the world's most famous overachiever with a complex. As a young artillery officer, Napoleon didn't just study war, he consumed it. He read Julius Caesar like it was self-help. He memorized military campaigns the way modern influencers memorize follow accounts. And he had plans. Big ones. The French Revolution, bless its guillotine-happy chaos, cracked open a door no sane monarch would have ever left ajar. Napoleon saw it and sprinted through. He rose fast. He suppressed uprisings with what polite historians call ruthless efficiency, and what others would call cannons pointed at civilians. He turned military victories into press campaigns, ensuring that the public believed he was part god, part genius, and part relatable man of the people who just happened to sleep in golden tents. By 1799, France was exhausted. Revolution had spun into collapse, the economy was in ruins, and the government was a revolving door of committees named after calendar months. Enter Napoleon, stage right, with a coup d'etat and the swagger of a man who had never been told no by someone who survived the day. As first consul, he promised reform, stability, a constitution. He gave them those things, sure, but also gave himself permanent power, total control, and eventually a shiny new title, Emperor, and not crowned by the Pope. Oh no. Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head in front of God and everyone. The message was clear. Divine right. Cute. But I'll handle the crowning, thanks. France didn't seem to mind. After years of bloodshed and uncertainty, Napoleon looked like order wrapped in military medals. He was efficient, tireless, brilliant, and most of all, victorious. Victory, after all, is the world's best cologne. He reformed the legal system with the Napoleonic Code, centralized the bureaucracy, balanced the budget, and made sure bread was cheap and the streets were clean. His enemies abroad called him a tyrant. His people called him stability, with a side of nationalism. His soldiers called him the little corporal. And behind closed doors, he called himself destiny. Let's talk about war, because Napoleon waged it like it was his love language. He didn't just fight battles, he orchestrated them. He knew terrain, timing, morale. He read the enemy like a gossip column and moved with the precision of a man who thought God had outsourced management of Europe to him personally. He crushed the Austrians. He danced through Italy. He broke Prussia's back. He humiliated Russia. At Austerlitz, he pulled off such a masterstroke of tactical deception that entire military academies still cried tears of joy over the maps. His enemies were smarter than average, but not smarter than Napoleon, hopped up on adrenaline and orchestral cannon fire. And then there were the siblings. The Bonaparte family. Napoleon didn't just rule, he franchised. Brothers became kings, sisters became queens, cousins got duchies. It was like Oprah, but with thrones. You get a crown and you get a crown. Unfortunately, none of them were particularly good at ruling. His brother Joseph became King of Spain and managed to make every Spanish citizen hate both France and furniture taxes. Jerome partied more than he governed. Lucien got in a fight with Napoleon and was sent to time out in Italy. The Bonapartes were not a dynasty. They were a group project run by a micromanager with battlefield PTSD. Yet through it all, Napoleon remained dominant. Europe bent, cracked, and adapted around him. Treaties were signed under duress, territories redrawn with the enthusiasm of a drunk cartographer. And still, Napoleon marched. By the early 1800s, he was unstoppable. Europe was his playground, and he played rough. But even the strongest empires rot from the inside. Napoleon was beginning to believe his own myth. And that's when things started to go sideways. He divorced Josephine not because he stopped loving her. In fact, he never really did stop. But because she couldn't produce a male heir. Practical? Yes. Cold-blooded? Also yes. Heartbroken? Definitely. But Napoleon was above feelings. Also, he told himself, he married Marie-Louise, the teenage daughter of the Austrian emperor, an actual Habsburg, an old enemy. It was the ultimate political flex, a peace treaty with a uterus. She gave him a son, whom he named the King of Rome. Subtle. And then came the continental system. Napoleon, tired of Britain constantly throwing ships, money and sarcasm at his empire, tried to economically strangle them. He banned trade with Britain across Europe. The idea, starve their economy. The reality, starve Europe. Prices soared, smuggling boomed. Napoleon's allies grumbled, his enemies laughed. But he didn't care. He had battles to win, borders to redraw, and legends to write. At his peak, Napoleon controlled more territory than almost anyone before him in Western Europe. He was history in motion. But like all epics, this one was about to take a turn. Because when you think you're invincible, you eventually do the one thing no rational conqueror should do. You invade Russia in the winter. Snow, starvation, and a man who wouldn't turn around. Napoleon Bonaparte, in all his map recoloring, sibling crowning, empire-stretching glory, made a mistake so colossal it could be seen from space. If satellites had existed in 1812, that mistake had a name: Russia. And it began with one of the most overconfident marches in military history. By the spring of 1812, Napoleon had convinced himself that the Russian Empire, vast and frozen though it was, would crumble under the boot of his Grande Armée. He had defeated Austrians, Prussians, and even managed to tame parts of Spain with a combination of cannon fire and confident walking. Why not Russia? He assembled an army of over 600,000 men, a multinational force that looked impressive on paper and even better during parades. Poles, Italians, Germans, French, a united nations of poor decisions. They were promised glory, land, and a swift march to Moscow. What they got was starvation, frostbite, and wolves. So many wolves. The campaign began in June, not exactly winter, but Russia has a special relationship with misery that doesn't require snow to be effective. The first problem: distance. Russia is big, very big, bigger than Napoleon's ego, and that's saying something. The roads were terrible, the maps were worse, and the locals weren't exactly offering hospitality. Tsar Alexander I had no intention of playing Napoleon's game. He adopted a strategy that every middle schooler with a sibling understands. If you don't engage, the other side gets tired and angry. The Russians retreated, burned their villages, scorched their fields, and left nothing behind. Napoleon marched forward, confident, irritated, and increasingly surrounded by ashes. Food ran low, horses died, the summer turned to autumn, and what remained of the roads turned to muck. Disease swept through the ranks. Dysentery, typhus, and despair did more damage than any musket. Still, Napoleon pressed on. Moscow was the goal, and Moscow, in his mind, meant victory. He reached the city in September, empty, abandoned, and already on fire. The Russians had set their own capital ablaze rather than let Napoleon have it. Imagine conquering a ghost town that smells like smoke and regret. That was Moscow. It burned for days while Napoleon sat in the Kremlin, waiting for a peace offer that never came. He waited a month. Supplies dwindled, the weather turned, and finally even Napoleon admitted that maybe, just maybe, this had been a terrible idea. He ordered a retreat. If the march to Moscow was grueling, the retreat was apocalyptic. The temperature plummeted, snow fell in relentless sheets. The army, already depleted and starving, now faced a white death. Frostbite blackened limbs, horses collapsed in the snow, soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever they could find. Rags, dead comrades' coats, broken flags. The retreat was chaos. Rear guard skirmishes with Russian forces, constant harassment from Cossacks, frozen rivers, bridges breaking under the weight of cannon and despair. At the Berezina River, the French army tried to cross on hastily built bridges while the Russians attacked from both sides. Thousands died in that single crossing. By the time Napoleon returned to Paris, fewer than 100,000 of his original 600,000 troops remained. Many were permanently maimed, some were too frostbitten to speak. Others simply disappeared, swallowed by snow and silence. Napoleon, master of spin, declared the campaign a success, a strategic withdrawal, a lesson in resilience. But Europe saw the truth. The myth had cracked. The man who had once rewritten maps now limped home with a ghost army and frostbitten pride. He waited a month. Supplies dwindled. The weather turned. And finally, even Napoleon admitted that maybe, just maybe, this had been a terrible idea. He ordered a retreat. If the march to Moscow was grueling, the retreat was apocalyptic. The temperature plummeted, snow fell in relentless sheets. The army, already depleted and starving, now faced a white death. Frostbite blackened limbs, horses collapsed in the snow. Soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever they could find. Rags, dead comrades' coats, broken flags. The retreat was chaos. Rear guard skirmishes with Russian forces, constant harassment from Cossacks, frozen rivers, bridges breaking under the weight of cannon and despair. At the Berezina River, the French army tried to cross on hastily built bridges while the Russians attacked from both sides. Thousands died in that single crossing. By the time Napoleon returned to Paris, fewer than 100,000 of his original 600,000 troops remained. Many were permanently maimed. Some were too frostbitten to speak. Others simply disappeared, swallowed by snow and silence. Napoleon, master of spin, declared the campaign a success. A strategic withdrawal. A lesson in resilience. But Europe saw the truth. The myth had cracked. The man who had once rewritten maps now limped home with a ghost army and frostbitten pride. The Sixth Coalition rose like a wave, a collection of kings, generals, and accountants who had had enough. Prussia, Austria, Russia, the United Kingdom, Sweden, and a few hangers-on joined forces, sensing this was their best shot. Napoleon rallied what troops he could, reorganized the government, spun propaganda like a man whose empire was not actively crumbling beneath his feet. He called up teenagers, pensioners, and anyone who could still hold a bayonet. France itself was exhausted. So was he. The decisive blow came at the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813. Also known as the Battle of the Nations, it was the largest and bloodiest battle of the Napoleonic Wars. More than 600,000 men clashed over 4 days. Cannon fire shook the earth, smoke turned daylight into dusk. Napoleon fought like a man who believed in miracles. But the Allies had numbers, they had coordination, they had momentum, and so Napoleon lost. France reeled. The Allies pressed into French territory. Napoleon's allies, those lovely puppet kings he had so generously installed, abandoned him faster than courtiers at a bankrupt banquet. In April 1814, with Paris surrounded, his marshals urged him to abdicate. He refused, then considered, then dramatically offered to abdicate in favor of his son. The Allies' ref, legacy, marble, and the man who wouldn't stay dead. Napoleon Bonaparte died in exile, but his legend marched on without him. While his actual body lay under a stone slab on St. Helena, his reputation was already galloping through the salons of Paris, painted in oil, etched in bronze, and whispered through generations. The French government brought his remains back in 1840 like a long-lost celebrity. The return was less funeral, more theatrical comeback. Cannons fired, crowds wept. The emperor had returned, embalmed in marble and myth. He was reburied at Les Invalides in a tomb so extravagant it could make Louis XIV blush. Massive, circular, and bathed in sunlight, it's a structure designed less for mourning and more for worship. People visit it the way you visit a shrine, half in awe, half in conspiracy theory. Because Napoleon wasn't just a man, he became an idea. In the years after his death, France couldn't quite decide how to feel. Half the country saw him as a tyrant, the other half as a national savior. What united them was fascination. Writers painted him as a tragic hero. Artists turned his defeats into noble suffering. Every field marshal who ever sneezed in his direction wrote a memoir. Victor Hugo called him the Great Comet of 1811. Tolstoy gave him a central role in War and Peace, as both genius and fool. Beethoven once admired him, then furiously scratched out a dedication when Napoleon declared himself emperor. Even pop culture got involved. You could buy Napoleon-themed everything, hats, plates, even wallpaper. And politics. Napoleon never really left. His legal system, the Napoleonic Code, is still the foundation of modern European law. His obsession with centralized authority echoes through governments to this day. And let's not ignore the template he left for future strongmen. Dress sharply, speak dramatically, rewrite history in real time. Bonus points for being short and furious. Napoleon III, yes, his actual nephew, rose to power decades later on nothing but nostalgia and good PR. The Bonaparte name carried weight. The idea of empire still danced in the French imagination. Even Hitler obsessed over him, Stalin too. Every dictator with delusions of grandeur has, at some point, studied Napoleon like a how-to manual. And yet, in all this myth-making, the real man gets blurrier. Was he a genius? Absolutely. Was he also reckless, vain, manipulative, and power-drunk? Oh yes. But history loves clean stories, so we pick the version of Napoleon that suits our needs. For France, he became a symbol of strength. For England, a cautionary tale. For historians, a case study in what happens when ambition outruns reality. There's a reason his name endures while many of his contemporaries are forgotten. It's not just because he changed the map, it's because he changed the script. He made war theatrical. He made government personal. He made failure look almost noble. Even in exile, he wrote his own legend. And the world bought it. So next time you hear someone described as having a Napoleon complex, remember, it's not really about height. It's about that rare, volatile mix of brilliance, insecurity, and the dangerous belief that the rules don't apply to you. Napoleon died on a rock in the ocean, but in a strange way, he got what he always wanted. To be remembered, to be argued over, to be immortal. And that, more than any crown or battlefield, may have been his greatest conquest. The rise of Messalina, Rome's teenage empress and political predator. Let's talk about a woman who broke every Roman rule and still managed to leave the empire gasping. Sometimes in admiration, often in horror. Valeria Messalina wasn't born to blend in. She entered the Roman political meat grinder already sharpened for battle. Her bloodline was imperial, her ambition undeniable, and her understanding of power disturbingly precise. In ancient Rome, where men died for ambition and women were supposed to stay ornamental, Messalina rewrote the entire playbook, with a dagger in one hand and a lover in the other. She married Claudius, a man old enough to be her father and dull enough to be manipulated like a pawn carved out of cheese. The world thought Claudius was harmless, but behind him stood Messalina, barely in her 20s, already pulling strings like she'd been born with a Senate seat. As empress, she didn't act like a background figure in a marble statue. She ran the palace like a CEO with a body count. Marriages, she arranged them. Enemies, she erased them. Political decisions, often hers. Claudius may have signed the laws, but Messalina whispered the edits. And she wasn't subtle. Her influence was whispered through every columned hallway of the imperial court. She turned seduction into strategy, rumor into weaponry. And her reputation, explosive. Ancient writers couldn't get enough of her escapades, many likely exaggerated, all fueled by the very real fear she inspired. Tacitus and Suetonius gleefully described her slipping out at night to compete with prostitutes. Was it fact or slander? Doesn't matter. What mattered was that everyone believed it, or wanted to, because Messalina was terrifyingly effective. Every affair, every alliance, every dinner party guest list, calculated, sharpened, and sometimes fatal. She wielded power with terrifying clarity. Lovers were upgraded to senators. Enemies were accused of treason or conveniently found dead. She was Rome's queenmaker, the palace puppet master with a honeyed smile and a heart full of knives. Messalina didn't just manipulate, she restructured power itself. Rome was a place of titles and whispers, and she thrived in both. She turned her status as mother to Britannicus, the imperial heir, into political armor. Few dared confront the mother of the future emperor. But her genius lay in building a network beneath the empire's polished veneer. Courtiers, freedmen, even senators were bought, seduced, or frightened into compliance. She orchestrated downfalls with the flick of a wrist and a whisper. Those who opposed her either disappeared into exile or into graves with a note reading, "Imperial business." She understood Rome's darker language. Power wasn't inherited, it was enforced. And still, her most powerful tool was performance. In public, she was the doting wife, eyes cast downward, hands clasped delicately. In private, she was fire in a velvet glove. Claudius believed her. Perhaps he needed to. His love for Messalina blinded him, willingly, to the rumors, to the blood on her hands, and to the alliances forged in bedrooms rather than Senate chambers. But Rome isn't kind to ambitious women, especially not those who win. Behind every rumor of debauchery was a senator nursing a bruised ego. Behind every whispered scandal was a power player who'd lost the game. Messalina's image, crafted by enemies and chroniclers, wasn't just scandalous, it was weaponized, lustful, power-hungry, dangerous. And yet, she survived, she thrived, until she didn't. In the cutthroat theatre of Roman power, no queen sits unchallenged for long. Messalina's enemies were numerous, but one of the most dangerous wasn't a senator or noblewoman. It was Narcissus, a freedman. A former slave turned imperial secretary, Narcissus wielded power most nobles only dreamed of. He controlled access to Claudius, managed the emperor's correspondence, and, more importantly, he knew exactly how vulnerable Claudius could be. For years, Narcissus tolerated Messalina, maybe even benefited from her chaos. But even he had a breaking point. When she crossed the line from seductress to usurper, it became clear she wasn't just a threat to Claudius's reputation, she was a threat to the empire. It all came crashing down when Messalina, in a move so reckless it bordered on theatrical, married her lover Gaius Silius in a public ceremony, while still married to Claudius. That wasn't just adultery, that was treason with cake. Silius wasn't just some handsome distraction, he was politically connected, wealthy and charming. He was everything Claudius was not, and that made him dangerous. Whether Messalina genuinely believed she could overthrow her husband or had simply lost touch with reality, the result was the same. She handed her enemies the perfect excuse. Narcissus moved fast. He bypassed the Senate, the court, even the Praetorian Guard. He went straight to Claudius. The emperor, shocked into rare clarity, listened as Narcissus laid out the betrayal, the ceremony, the plot. Claudius was devastated. His beloved wife, the mother of his child, had crowned another man. He staggered, silent, before finally handing Narcissus emergency authority. Rome held its breath. What followed was a purge. Silius was executed without trial. His allies, real or imagined, were rounded up and dealt with. Those too slow to betray Messalina found themselves bleeding in courtyards. The Praetorian Guard turned from protectors to hunters. For once, Rome didn't whisper. It roared. Messalina fled. Not to escape. No, she still believed Claudius would forgive her. She went to the gardens of Lucullus, begged to see her husband, pleaded for mercy. But the emperor she'd once manipulated was gone. In his place was a man who had finally taken back his crown. Claudius hesitated, still torn between fury and memory. Narcissus didn't. He sent a centurion with a message: die with dignity, or die in disgrace. Messalina, usually so composed, panicked. She stalled, she trembled, she lifted the dagger, then froze. In the end, the centurion did it for her. She died alone, bloodied, betrayed, and powerless. The empire didn't mourn, it moved on. Claudius ordered her name erased, statues destroyed, records purged, but Rome remembered. You always remember a fire that burns that bright. Aftermath, ghosts, heirs, and the rise of Agrippina. Roman women noticed. Behind closed doors, powerful families began maneuvering to replace the fallen empress. Claudius, emotionally gutted and politically adrift, was more vulnerable than ever. This wasn't a period of healing. It was a reset, a dangerous, unstable calm. Claudius's trust in those around him had shattered, and he became increasingly reliant on his freedmen, especially Narcissus, who now wielded such immense influence he practically ruled by proxy. Rome, meanwhile, began rewriting its favorite bedtime story. Messalina wasn't just remembered as an adulterous empress. She became a cautionary tale, a byword for lust and treachery, a lesson carved in scandal. Her legend, twisted and magnified, became more powerful in death than she ever was in life. She had been purged from the imperial narrative, but not from the Roman imagination. While her body was buried in obscurity, Her ghost lingered in the shadows of Palatine Hill, whispered about, laughed at, feared. In the wake of Messalina's execution, Claudius found himself in an awkward position. An emperor without an empress, a father with a vulnerable heir, and a court full of ambitious opportunists. The empire needed a matron, a stabilizing force, but Claudius, wounded by betrayal, was reluctant to remarry. Enter Agrippina the Younger. She was everything Messalina had been, and more. Beautiful, intelligent, calculating, dangerous. But unlike Messalina, Agrippina wasn't reckless. She was methodical. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, daughter of Germanicus, sister to Caligula, and mother of a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, later known as Nero, Agrippina saw her chance. She played the long game. Where Messalina had seduced, Agrippina negotiated. She convinced Claudius that marrying her would restore dignity to the imperial house. She promised loyalty, order, and, most importantly, a unified dynasty. Claudius, aging and increasingly manipulated by his inner circle, eventually agreed. Their marriage, though controversial due to their familial connection, was made legal by a special Senate decree. Agrippina became Empress of Rome. But this was no love story. Agrippina didn't want to share the throne. She wanted to control it. She began by purging Messalina's remaining allies and dismantling her legacy. She isolated Claudius from his former advisors and installed loyalists in every key post. Most significantly, she began grooming her own son Nero as the future emperor. Step by step, she erased Britannicus, Messalina's son and the rightful heir, not with violence, but with obscurity. She portrayed him as immature, unfit to rule. She had Nero adopted by Claudius and granted a string of names and titles that all but made him a living prophecy. Britannicus became a prisoner in his own home. His tutors were replaced, his allies exiled or silenced. As Nero's star rose, Britannicus was left to wither in the shadows. Alive but politically extinct. Claudius, drifting further into manipulation and distraction, seemed to forget his son entirely. He lavished Nero with honors, and the memory of Messalina was swept under the marble floor like ash. When Claudius died, likely poisoned, perhaps by Agrippina, Nero was declared emperor without opposition. Britannicus, now a teenager, was a loose end, a symbol of the past, a threat to Agrippina's design. A year later, during a banquet, Britannicus collapsed. The official cause? Epilepsy. The real cause? Poison, administered on Nero's orders, according to ancient sources. Messalina's legacy died with her son. The imperial line she fought to preserve wasn't defeated in battle, it was erased over dinner. The year of the 4 emperors, Rome unravels. With Nero's death in 68 CE, the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended. Not with a glorious funeral or triumphant procession, but with a whimper, a fleeing boy, and an empire suddenly without a plan. What followed was one of the most chaotic years in Roman history. The year of the 4 emperors. First came Galba, a stern old general who marched on Rome with the Senate's blessing. But Galba's rule was less a reign and more a brief pause in panic. He was cold, miserly, and wildly unpopular with the army, who, in Rome, happened to be the final vote on everything. When Galba refused to pay his soldiers a donative, basically a bribe for loyalty, they stopped pretending to like him. Enter Otho, a former friend of Nero and a man who styled himself as a more fun, more familiar emperor. Otho had Galba murdered in the Forum and took the purple robe for himself. Otho's reign, 90 days. He barely had time to hang new curtains before a challenge came from the east. Vitellius, a gluttonous general backed by the legions in Germania. Vitellius stormed into Italy, and Otho, unable to defeat him in battle, chose to fall on his sword, literally. He died a tragic figure, claiming he didn't want to start another civil war. That was noble. Vitellius was not. Vitellius entered Rome like a butcher into a wine cellar. He gorged on banquets, executed rivals, and indulged every vice. The city descended into chaos, bodies piled up, treasury emptied, and Rome, for all its military glory, now looked like a beheaded beast stumbling in the dark. But even Vitellius had enemies. In the eastern provinces, a quiet force was rising. Vespasian, a general known for discipline and results. While the Western emperors drank and dueled, Vespasian gathered legions and built alliances. In December of 69 CE, his forces stormed Rome. Vitellius tried to hide. Disguised as a servant, he was dragged from his hiding place, paraded through the streets, and executed in the Forum. His last words are lost to history, possibly muffled by roast chicken. And with that, the year closed with Vespasian taking the throne. He wasn't born royal, he wasn't born rich, but he would restore order and rebuild the empire, brick by brick. The year of the 4 emperors wasn't just chaos, it was a test. Could Rome survive without the bloodline of Caesar? The answer, barely. But yes. And now, with a new dynasty, one built not on legacy but on merit, the empire would rise again, tempered by fire and sharpened by blood. But the ghosts of Nero, Messalina, and all the Julio-Claudians still lingered in the marble. Their stories weren't over, just waiting for another scandal to stir them back to life. The myth of Messalina, from scandal to symbol. The more Rome tried to forget her, the more immortal she became. Over centuries, Valeria Messalina transformed from a flesh-and-blood empress into a myth. Rome's ultimate symbol of feminine vice, lust and betrayal. But was that reputation earned or constructed? Most of what we know about Messalina comes from ancient authors like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal, men who had little sympathy for women in power, especially women who acted with ambition, independence, or, gods forbid, sexual agency. To them, she wasn't a political actor. She was a warning, a scandal wrapped in silk and sin. They painted her as a femme fatale who turned the imperial palace into a bordello. They told tales of her sneaking into brothels, of a shameless public marriage while Claudius still reigned, and of affairs so numerous they bordered on satire. But these stories often read less like history and more like moral panic, fueled by misogyny, outrage, and a burning need to control the narrative. Modern historians have begun to challenge this portrayal. They note how Roman patriarchy had a nasty habit of rewriting powerful women as monstrous. Cleopatra, Agrippina the Younger, Fulvia, each of them demonized after their fall from grace. Messalina simply fit the mold too well. Beautiful, cunning, ambitious, and ultimately doomed. She wasn't the first to be slandered. She wouldn't be the last. And yet, even stripped of legend, Messalina remains formidable. Behind the salacious headlines was a woman who wielded real power. She maneuvered through Rome's treacherous court, eliminated rivals, secured her son's succession, and held sway over an emperor considered too mild for the throne. In a world of togas and testosterone, she turned femininity into a weapon, and for a time ruled with it. Her downfall, when it came, wasn't merely scandalous, it was consequential. It shattered Claudius's trust, cleared the way for Agrippina's rise, and set the stage for Nero's chaotic reign. Messalina's ambition didn't just define her, it reshaped the line of Roman emperors. That's no small legacy. In death, her influence only grew. Messalina became art, opera, literature. She inspired plays, novels, films, each retelling exaggerating her seductions, scandals, and fall. She was Rome's ultimate cautionary tale, the seductress, the betrayer, the wild empress who couldn't be tamed. But perhaps what frightened Rome most wasn't her lust, it was her effectiveness. Messalina proved that a woman could move through the imperial court with as much ruthlessness as any senator, that she could play the game and for a time win it. Rome's writers couldn't accept that, so they mythologized her, demonized her, made her infamous. Messalina didn't just scandalize an empire, she exposed its fears about sex, power, and the kind of woman who refused to wait quietly in the shadows. And that, more than any affair or whispered rumor, was her most dangerous legacy. Agrippina's reign, power, poison, and a mother's ambition. Agrippina the Younger didn't inherit power, she seized it. Where Messalina had played the temptress, Agrippina played the tactician. Born into the blood-stained lineage of Rome's most powerful family, she was no stranger to the game. Daughter of Germanicus, sister to Caligula, niece and wife to Claudius, and mother to Nero, her family tree was less a lineage and more a live wire. By the time she stepped into the imperial court as empress, Agrippina knew what Rome did to women who dared to lead, and she prepared accordingly. Unlike Messalina, Agrippina never let passion blur her vision. Her loyalty was not to love or lust, it was to survival and succession. From the moment she married Claudius, her eyes were set on one goal, making her son Nero emperor. To do that, she'd need to reshape the imperial court, marginalize Britannicus, and control the man she now called husband. First came image. Agrippina cast herself not as a lover or plaything, but as Rome's matron, dignified, noble, and fiercely moral. She broke tradition by appearing beside Claudius in public events, issuing edicts, and even having coins minted with her face. A move previously unthinkable for a Roman woman. She wasn't just the emperor's wife, she was presenting herself as co-ruler. Behind closed doors, she was even more audacious. She exiled Messalina's remaining allies, filled key government posts with loyalists, and surrounded Nero with tutors and guards loyal to her. Where Messalina ruled with impulse, Agrippina ruled with plans. Her vision was long and her patience unnerving. Claudius, for his part, was aging and distracted. Whether through poison, paranoia, or political exhaustion, he became increasingly passive, perhaps aware that his throne was no longer entirely his. Ancient sources suggest Agrippina orchestrated his death, possibly with poisoned mushrooms, the emperor's favorite dish. Whether that's myth or fact, one thing is certain. With Claudius gone, Nero's path was clear. At just 17, Nero was crowned emperor, but it was Agrippina who truly held the reins. She sat beside him at meetings, issued orders in his name, and even received diplomatic delegations. For a brief, extraordinary moment, Rome was ruled by a woman in everything but title. But power never shares nicely. As Nero aged, so did his desire for independence and his irritation with his mother's shadow. Agrippina, who had pulled every string to raise him, now found herself resented, resisted, and eventually replaced. The tension escalated. Nero removed her allies, revoked her honors, and tried to sideline her influence. Agrippina pushed back, sometimes quietly, sometimes dangerously. But Rome had no room for two emperors, and certainly none for one in a woman's toga. The end came as it always did in imperial Rome, with blood. Nero, now fully emperor in his own right and paranoid about plots, arranged his mother's assassination. First, he tried a collapsing boat. When she swam to shore, he sent soldiers to finish the job. Agrippina, legend says, bared her womb to the assassin, saying, "Strike here." This bore Nero. Her death wasn't just matricide. It was the climax of a war for control over the empire's soul. Agrippina had built an emperor, raised a dynasty, and shaped a century. Her ambition was her legacy and her undoing. Like Messalina before her, Agrippina refused to fit the mold Rome had designed for women. She was too bold, too public, too powerful, and so, like Messalina, she had to be erased. But the erasure didn't work. History remembers her still, not as a villain or a victim, but as the woman who tried to outplay the empire at its own brutal game, and nearly did. Nero, fire, fury, and the final collapse. Nero Claudius Caesar was never supposed to rule, not in the natural order of Rome. He was adopted into power through Agrippina's ambition and groomed into the emperor's toga by her design. But once the purple was his, Nero turned from heir to horror show, proving that sometimes the greatest danger to an empire is a boy raised in a palace with no boundaries. At first, Nero's rule was surprisingly smooth. He was young, charismatic, artistically inclined, and had some genuinely competent advisors: Seneca the philosopher, Burrus the head of the Praetorian Guard. Together, they guided the teenage emperor through the early years, crafting laws, easing taxes, and pleasing the people. But a boy emperor rarely stays a boy. Power began to ferment in Nero's veins. He fancied himself not just ruler, but artist, actor, god. He sang, performed poetry, raced chariots, and demanded Rome applaud, not because he was good, but because he was emperor. Then came the turning point. Agrippina, once the puppet master, found herself sidelined. Nero resented her control, her presence, her history. His mother had killed for him, but now she was in his way. After multiple failed plots, Nero had her murdered. It was not a clean affair. First a sabotaged boat, then assassins. The boy who owed her everything ended her with a dagger she never saw coming. Rome took notice. So did Nero's conscience. For a time he descended into guilt, paranoia, and madness. But guilt in emperors rarely lasts. Absolute power has a way of rewriting memory. From there, Nero's rule spun into theatrical chaos. He divorced and murdered his wife Octavia, stomped another pregnant lover to death, burned enemies in gardens as human torches, and allegedly played his lyre while Rome burned in 64 AD. Historians debate whether he actually fiddled, but the metaphor stuck. The Great Fire gave Nero both a scapegoat and a blank canvas. He blamed the Christians, a new, unpopular sect, and began one of the earliest major persecutions in Roman history. Then, with central Rome reduced to ash, he claimed the land for a vast pleasure palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, complete with a revolving dining room and colossal statue of himself. Empires crumbled while he built monuments to his ego. But back in Rome, plots festered. Nobles, generals, even his own advisors began conspiring. One by one, they died, forced to commit suicide under Nero's watch. Even Seneca, his once beloved mentor, was ordered to open his own veins. Rome was becoming a stage drenched in blood. By 68 AD, revolt ignited. The governor of Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex, rose against Nero. Then Galba, governor of Hispania, declared himself emperor. The Senate finally turned. The Praetorian Guard bribed and with that, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line of Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, collapsed in a final act of narcissistic tragedy. No gods intervened, no empire endured. Just a fallen emperor and the echo of applause no longer forced. Hidden fathers and the hypocrisies of founding myths. Thomas Jefferson, author of the words "All men are created equal," lived a contradiction that still echoes through American history. Though he publicly championed liberty, in private, he maintained an institution that denied it: slavery. His most controversial and telling relationship was with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman at Monticello who bore him several children. Despite never acknowledging the relationship publicly, Jefferson quietly freed all of Hemings's surviving children, the only enslaved people he ever emancipated during his lifetime. The records are damning. Hemings' pregnancies consistently aligned with Jefferson's time at Monticello. Plantation logs, handwritten notes, everything pointed to a hidden family that Jefferson never named aloud. While some of the children escaped in suspiciously convenient circumstances, others were freed officially, passed quietly into freedom, bearing striking resemblance to their father. Sally Hemings never left behind her own writings. Her story comes through records made by others, men who reduced her to a footnote, a possession. But her children's stories survived, etched into American history as citizens born from silence, secrecy, and systemic contradiction. Behind Jefferson's polished Enlightenment philosophy stood a truth America still wrestles with. The founding ideals were always shadowed by founding hypocrisies. Benjamin Franklin, on the other hand, was a man defined by contradictions, but he flaunted them. Celebrated as an inventor, diplomat, and philosopher, Franklin had a shadow life that pulsed with mystery and mischief. While in England, he was rumored to have ties to the Hellfire Club, a secret society known for its libertine ethos and underground hedonism. Their motto, "Do what thou wilt." Whether Franklin was a core member or an amused observer, he certainly moved in those circles. In Paris, he was equally notorious. French salons adored him. Women adored him. Letters to and about Franklin make clear he had numerous romantic entanglements even in his old age. His quip that older women made better lovers, "They don't yell, they don't tell, and they're grateful as hell," offers a glimpse into the bawdier side of the man now immortalized on the $100 bill. Franklin also thrived behind literary masks. Using pseudonyms like Mrs. Silence Dogood and Richard Saunders, he explored taboo topics, sex, hypocrisy, and power, often with biting satire. Married to Deborah Reed, Franklin spent years abroad, often behaving like a bachelor. Historians still speculate he may have fathered children outside of marriage. What's undeniable is that he lived by appetite, intellectual and physical, and rarely apologized for it. George Washington, meanwhile, was a man who wore restraint like a uniform. Stoic, deliberate, and image-obsessed, he curated his legacy meticulously. He declined a salary for his military role, choosing instead to be reimbursed for expenses, perhaps to project humility or avoid accusations of greed. He burned personal letters, including a rumored early romance with Sally Fairfax, the wife of a friend. His marriage to Martha Washington was respectful and supportive, but lacked passion. After his death, she destroyed nearly all their correspondence, an act of preservation or erasure, perhaps both. Washington feared how history would remember him, and so he tried to shape it. But even the father of the nation had a temper. Quiet in public, he reportedly exploded in private. He held grudges. He doubted himself. He was, in the end, not marble, but mortal. A man who wanted to be remembered for dignity, even if it meant hiding his doubts and desires. The founding fathers were not statues. They were men, brilliant, flawed, driven by principle and appetite alike. And behind every parchment and powder wig lies a web of secrets, shaped by the very contradictions they tried to write out of history: exile, echoes, and the emperor of nothing. Napoleon Bonaparte had once been the master of Europe. a man who redrew borders like doodles on parchment, crowned himself emperor in defiance of tradition, and flung armies like dice across a bloodied map. But by 1814, the gambler had run out of luck. The Allies closed in. Paris fell. The throne was no longer his, and for a brief moment, the world sighed with exhausted relief. His punishment? Exile, not death, not a dungeon, but Elba, a Mediterranean speck given to the man who had once demanded the world. But here's the twist. You don't banish a man like Napoleon and expect silence. From the moment his boots hit the island, he treated exile like an internship. He reorganized Elba's economy, improved its infrastructure, designed a flag. Yes, Napoleon, dethroned, disgraced, and effectively grounded, made himself Emperor of Elba. It was almost adorable. Almost. Back in France, Bourbon monarchy returned. Louis XVIII was back on the throne, pudgy and uncharismatic, like a paperweight pretending to be a ruler. The people grumbled, the army sulked, and over in Elba, Napoleon watched, waited, and sharpened his legend like a blade. Then in 1815, he did the unthinkable again. He escaped. He returned to France not with an army, but with a promise: liberty, glory, pensions. As he marched north, soldiers sent to stop him instead knelt before him. By the time he reached Paris, the king had fled, and Napoleon, incredibly, was back on the throne. 100 days of chaos followed. But hubris has a shelf life. Europe didn't laugh this time, it mobilized. At Waterloo, Napoleon faced his final reckoning. Outnumbered, misjudging the terrain, and abandoned by fate, he lost. Utterly. And this time, there would be no Elba. He was sent to St. Helena, a rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from relevance. No power, no court, just wind, rain, and memory. There, in Longwood House, Napoleon wrote, dictated, and mythologized. He blamed others. He romanticized failure. He painted himself as a martyr of ambition. And slowly, he unraveled. Gone were the grand battles. Gone were the uniforms and parades. All that remained was a man growing sicker, lonelier, and increasingly delusional. His entourage shrank. His health crumbled. His stomach betrayed him. Possibly cancer, possibly poison. And in 1821, the emperor died, far from France, with no orchestra, no audience, and no applause. Yet, as always, he had the last word. Napoleon's legend didn't end at St. Helena. It began anew. His body returned to France years later, interred in a marble tomb so grand it practically screams, this was no ordinary man. And maybe he wasn't. He was a tyrant and a tactician, a genius and a megalomaniac. He gave France laws, Europe wars, and history an addiction to drama. His life was a cautionary opera, one sung in cannon blasts and whispered in the halls of power centuries after his death. So remember him not just as the man who crowned himself, but as the man who refused to vanish, even in exile. He fall of a republic, Julius Caesar, dictatorship, and the last breath of Roman democracy. Before the empire, there was a republic, a messy, ambitious, brilliant experiment in oligarchic democracy, where senators wore togas, votes were bribed with bread and circuses, and power was a balancing act between aristocratic tradition and populist flair. At the heart of this system rose a man too charismatic to ignore, too ambitious to restrain, and too dangerous to let live. Gaius Julius Caesar. Let's rewind. Caesar wasn't born a dictator. He was born into the Julian clan, noble but not rich. He had connections to Marius, the popularist warlord, and that meant Sulla, the conservative dictator of the time, wanted him dead. Caesar survived by disappearing, joining the army, and coming back seasoned, shrewd, and ready to climb. He was a genius of self-promotion. He borrowed money he didn't have, dressed lavishly, and threw extravagant games, all on credit. He seduced senators' wives and made allies out of enemies. He was the kind of politician who could insult you to your face and leave you smiling. His real rise came through the first triumvirate, a secret alliance with Pompey the Great and Crassus the Rich. A general, a banker, and a rising star walk into a republic. Together they rigged elections, divided power, and gave Caesar command in Gaul. Then Caesar left Rome and began rewriting history, with blood and ink. The Gallic Wars were both a conquest and a press tour. Caesar wasn't just fighting barbarians, he was narrating his genius back to Rome in glowing third-person prose. He sent letters that read like fan fiction about himself. He slaughtered tribes, crossed rivers, and pushed the Roman frontier beyond anything imagined, all while stacking glory like poker chips. But while Caesar was conquering Gaul, Rome was cracking. Crassus died fighting Parthians, Pompey turned conservative, and the Senate grew anxious. Caesar was too powerful, too beloved, and worst of all, he was coming home. Rome demanded he disband his army before entering. Caesar famously responded by crossing the Rubicon River, a symbolic red line, and saying, "The die is cast." With that, the Republic gasped. A general had just marched on his own city. Civil war followed. Caesar versus Pompey. Rome tore itself apart. Cities burned. Allies flipped. In the end, Caesar won. Pompey fled to Egypt and was unceremoniously beheaded. Caesar wept, but took control. Then he started ruling like a man who knew the clock was ticking. He enacted reforms, debt relief, calendar restructuring, "You're welcome, July," citizenship expansions. He centralized power, sidelined the Senate, and accepted titles like dictator for life. He was becoming a king in all but name, and Romans, especially senators, had strong feelings about kings. Catherine the Great, power, propaganda, and the bedroom myths. Let's shift the stage to 18th century Russia, where powdered wigs met snow-dusted ambition, and empires were run not by men with swords, but by one woman with steel in her spine and rumors in her shadow, Catherine the Great. Catherine wasn't born Russian. She wasn't even born Catherine. Born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess, she arrived in Russia as a teenager, married off to the awkward and unstable heir to the throne, Peter III. He played with toy soldiers. She plotted revolutions. He loved Prussia. She learned to love power. By the time Peter III finally made it to the throne, Catherine had already made up her mind. He wouldn't keep it long. In 1762, just 6 months into his reign, she staged a coup, bloodless, elegant, and effective. Peter was arrested, encouraged to abdicate, and died shortly after under mysterious circumstances. Catherine didn't flinch. She was now Empress of all Russia, and she ruled like it. For over 3 decades, Catherine modernized the Russian Empire with Enlightenment ideals, legal reforms, educational expansion, and administrative overhauls. She corresponded with Voltaire, collected art, and turned St. Petersburg into a jewel of European culture. But for all her accomplishments, Catherine's story would be hijacked, not by her policies, but by her personal life. The whispers came quickly. She had lovers, yes, many. Handsome officers, charming courtiers, gifted politicians. Some helped her rule, others simply kept her company. But in the minds of her enemies, foreign and domestic, her lovers became proof of moral corruption. Her sexuality was weaponized against her legacy. The most infamous slander, the myth that Catherine died in a compromising position with a horse, a story concocted by her political enemies and spread gleefully by those uncomfortable with a woman who ruled like a man. It was nonsense, of course, but also deeply revealing. Men could philander, seduce, and exploit, without losing their crowns. Women, they had to die clean or be remembered dirty. Catherine anticipated this. She was obsessed with legacy, commissioning paintings, busts, and histories that cast her as enlightened and powerful. But she couldn't fully control what came after. And so, to this day, for many, Catherine the Great isn't remembered for her foreign policy or philosophical contributions. She's remembered for a bedroom myth, salacious, stupid, and stubborn. Yet beneath the rumors lies a truth. Catherine outmaneuvered kings, seduced ministers, and rewrote the rules of female power. She didn't inherit greatness, she built it and named it her own. If the price was scandal, so be it. The cult of the Caesars, legacy, lies, and the invention of imperial power. The death of Nero marked more than the end of a dynasty. It marked the end of illusion. The Julio-Claudians had spun divine favor, noble blood, and sheer violence into a web of near mystical authority. But after Nero, that web unraveled. Rome had to face what it had built, a machine powered by personality cults, gilded murder, and a public that cheered as emperors burned. In the wake of Nero's death, Rome spiraled into chaos, the year of the 4 emperors. Pretenders rose, legions mutinied, provinces revolted. The throne became a prize for whoever had the sharpest sword and the best spin. But out of the blood-soaked dust rose Vespasian, a military man, not of noble birth, who understood that myth had to be managed. He didn't promise divine ancestry, he promised competence. Under the Flavian dynasty, the empire was reborn not as a family affair, but as a machine of power. Emperors were no longer gods. They were PR products, sculpted in marble and broadcast on coinage. Temples and amphitheaters replaced oracles and augurs. History was curated, predecessors rewritten, and failures conveniently forgotten. But the ghost of the Caesars lingered. Every new ruler feared becoming the next Nero, even as they mimicked him. Rome had learned one truth: spectacle mattered more than morality. A great fire could destroy half the city, but if you rebuilt it in white stone and called it rebirth, the crowd might cheer. Part 14 explores this shift, from bloodlines to brand, from divine lineage to political choreography. We watch Rome evolve from imperial dynasty into imperial theater, where emperors rose and fell not by godly will, but by public favor, propaganda, and who could tell the best story. This wasn't just history, it was history curated. The rise of Vespasian, from battlefield to bureaucracy. Vespasian's ascent to power was not the result of noble birth or inherited prestige. It was carved out of blood, mud, and relentless pragmatism. Born in 9 AD to a modest equestrian family in Reate, his rise through Rome's military and political ranks was slow but steady. He was no silver-tongued aristocrat or dreamy philosopher king. He was a soldier, a disciplined, no-nonsense man who smelled more like the barracks than the Senate floor. And Rome, after Nero's operatic collapse, was ready for that. When Nero's death triggered the year of the 4 emperors in 69 AD, it was a nationwide audition for sanity. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius each briefly claimed the purple, but none could stabilize the chaos. Enter Vespasian, fresh off his command, suppressing the Jewish revolt in Judea. His troops loved him, his allies respected him, and most importantly, he promised something no one else could: relief from imperial melodrama. His supporters declared him emperor, and he marched on Rome. By December, Vitellius was dead, the Senate had relented, and Vespasian was emperor. But the real challenge was just beginning. Vespasian didn't just inherit an empire, he inherited an exhausted, bankrupt, and cynical public. Rome had seen enough gold-plated madness. It craved order. So Vespasian delivered. He slashed unnecessary spending. He restructured the tax system. He promoted men based on competence rather than lineage, a move that made patricians nervous but revitalized the bureaucracy. He stabilized the provinces. He turned the Flavian dynasty into a brand of solid, stone-faced rule. And he built. Oh, he built. Most famously, the Flavian amphitheater, better known as the Colosseum, a giant arena of stone and blood designed to entertain and distract. Bread and circuses, rebuilt with Roman engineering. But Vespasian also had a sense of humor. When criticized for instituting a tax on public urinals, he famously held a coin to his nose and declared, "Money does not stink." It was crude, it was clever, it was Roman. Part 15 follows this remarkable man, not just how he claimed power, but how he wielded it. With practicality, with sarcasm, and with a builder's eye. This wasn't the return of imperial grandeur. It was the dawn of imperial adulthood. Domitian, fear, marble, and the birth of the imperial autocrat. Domitian was Vespasian's younger son, and unlike his brother Titus, who ruled briefly and died beloved, Domitian ruled for 15 years in a cloud of paranoia, control, and calculated terror. He was not a soldier king. He was not a philosopher ruler. Domitian was the first Roman emperor to fully embrace the mechanics of absolute power without apology. And he didn't care if you liked him. He centralized authority. He shut the Senate out of meaningful governance. He expanded the imperial bureaucracy, favored loyalty over pedigree, and, perhaps most importantly, rewrote the script of what an emperor looked and sounded like. Domitian insisted on being called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Under his rule, Rome glittered. He completed grand building projects, repaired the Colosseum, and beautified the city. But the sparkle was backed by fear. Informants, secret police, treason trials, these weren't bugs of his reign, they were features. He curated an image of divine right and competence, even as whispers mounted and senators disappeared. Artists and poets walked tightropes. Loyalty wasn't rewarded with favor, it was rewarded with survival. And yet, Domitian lasted. Not because he was loved, but because he was efficient. Brutality worked. Until it didn't. In 96 AD, a conspiracy among palace officials, including his own wife, ended in assassination. The Senate, relieved and vengeful, condemned his memory. Statues smashed, names chiseled away, his reign erased. But erasure never quite works. Domitian's rule left a blueprint for autocracy. What Augustus wrapped in elegance, Domitian unwrapped in marble fists. And later emperors, from Diocletian to Constantine, would borrow his tactics. This was the moment Rome turned fully from republic in memory to empire in fact. Part 16 explores that final transformation. Domitian didn't just end a dynasty, he redefined how power behaved in Rome. Less parade, more police state. Less illusion, more control. It's not a fall, it's a hardening. The empire didn't die here, it calcified. The philosopher and the general, Nerva, Trajan, and the reinvention of Rome. After the chaos and fear of Domitian's autocracy, Rome stood bruised but not broken. It needed healing. It needed calm. Enter Nerva, an elderly senator with a calm temperament and no children. He wasn't chosen for strength, but for stability. The Senate, still reeling from Domitian's iron grip, wanted an emperor who wouldn't terrify them. Nerva promised a return to the old values, restoring senatorial dignity, scaling back the paranoia, and throwing open the palace gates to a breath of political fresh air. But goodwill doesn't always guarantee control. Within a year, the Praetorian Guard revolted over unpaid wages and demanded justice for Domitian's murder. Nerva, backed into a corner, made a decision that would change Rome forever. he adopted Trajan. Trajan was everything Nerva wasn't: young, battle-hardened, beloved by the military and politically shrewd. It was the perfect handoff. When Nerva died peacefully, a rare luxury, Trajan took the reins without bloodshed. And thus began the era that would later be called the height of the Roman Empire. Trajan wasn't content with peace, he wanted conquest. Under his rule, Rome expanded to its greatest territorial extent, stretching from Britain to the Persian Gulf. But unlike past conquerors, Trajan didn't rule with vanity. He ruled with pragmatism and infrastructure. He built roads, aqueducts, ports. He launched massive public works, fed the poor, and famously declared, "An emperor should be like a shepherd, caring for his flock, not devouring them." He brought honor back to the throne, not with pomp, but with purpose. And yet, even this golden age had its shadows. Trajan's wars were costly. His successors would struggle to hold the borders he pushed so far. But for a brief moment, under Nerva and Trajan, the Roman Empire wasn't just powerful, it was admired. Part 17 marks the beginning of Rome's second wind. Less tyranny, more triumph. It was a reminder that even empires can evolve, at least for a while. Hadrian, walls, wisdom, and the price of preservation. If Trajan was the empire's builder, then Hadrian was its architect, not of conquest, but of consolidation. When he inherited the throne in 117 CE, the empire was bursting at its seams. Rather than push further, Hadrian pulled back, tightening Rome's borders like a tailor resizing a garment stretched too thin. Hadrian was a thinker, a poet, a philosopher-king in the mold of Greece's great minds, fluent in Greek and obsessed with Hellenistic culture. He didn't just rule, he toured. Hadrian personally visited nearly every province of the empire, walking among soldiers, inspecting cities, and even helping sketch architectural plans. He wasn't ruling from a marble seat in Rome. He was out in the mud, building the empire he envisioned, one fortified mile at a time. His most famous project, a wall, a really big one. Stretching across northern Britain, Hadrian's wall was less about keeping out barbarians and more about making a statement. This is Rome, and this is where it ends. It was the stone embodiment of imperial realism, an emperor admitting that eternal expansion wasn't sustainable. Hadrian also reformed bureaucracy, reorganized the military, and championed merit over birthright in government positions. He believed that the empire wasn't held together by force alone, but by cohesion, communication, and competence. But Hadrian wasn't without contradictions. While he promoted unity, he also suppressed revolts with brutal efficiency, most notoriously in Judea, where his policies triggered the Bar Kokhba rebellion. The result was catastrophic: thousands killed, cities razed, Jewish religious practices banned. Hadrian renamed the province and even tried to erase Jewish identity from the map. Personally, Hadrian was enigmatic. He deeply mourned the death of his young companion Antinous, whose mysterious drowning in the Nile became a divine myth. Hadrian deified him, erected statues across the empire, and even founded a city in his name. Some saw it as grief, others saw it as obsession. As Hadrian aged, his health declined and his paranoia grew. He became reclusive and often cruel. He appointed successors only to turn on them. Eventually, he named Antoninus Pius as his heir, but only on the condition that Antoninus would adopt two more, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. It was legacy management with all the precision of Roman engineering. Hadrian died in 138 CE. His body, initially refused burial in Rome, was later interred in what would become Castel Sant'Angelo. Even in death, he left behind a monument, not just of stone, but of an empire redefined by borders, stability, and the quiet strength of maintenance over ambition. Hadrian's legacy is one of restraint, intellect, and infrastructure. He didn't give Rome new lands, but he gave it longevity. And sometimes the greatest strength lies not in reaching further, but in knowing when to stop. Antoninus Pius, the calm before the storm. If Rome ever had a golden intermission, a pause between dramas, wars, and madness, it was under Antoninus Pius. Succeeding Hadrian in 138 CE, Antoninus ruled for 23 peaceful years, leaving behind no tales of conquest or collapse. And that's exactly what made him exceptional. Antoninus didn't expand borders or ignite revolts. He rarely left Italy and never led troops into battle. Instead, he governed with patience, consistency, and bureaucratic elegance. Where Hadrian traveled, Antoninus wrote letters. Where emperors before him built walls or tore down cities, Antoninus repaired temples and balanced budgets. His reign was a masterclass in steady-handed leadership, less marble and triumph, more paperwork and prudence. He earned his nickname Pius not for religious zeal, but for his dutiful respect toward Hadrian, whom the Senate despised. When they refused to deify the late emperor, Antoninus insisted, lobbying hard and threatening to resign if they didn't comply. It wasn't about faith, it was about loyalty and continuity, ensuring a smooth imperial transition. Antoninus's internal policies were humane and reform-minded. He improved legal rights for slaves, expanded the empire's food supply chain, and ensured provinces were treated less like conquered territories and more like partners in a shared Roman identity. He also invested heavily in infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, schools, the kind of projects that win no battles, but win the hearts of citizens. But his peace came with a price. The empire's frontiers, though quiet, were beginning to simmer. Antoninus had little appetite for military confrontation and preferred diplomacy to aggression. That meant unresolved tensions in Britannia, Dacia, and the Germanic territories were simply deferred. Rome under Antoninus wasn't fixing its roof, it was just enjoying the weather. He also stayed in Rome for nearly his entire reign, which created a sense of imperial distance. While effective administratively, Antoninus lacked the charismatic public presence of his predecessors. His rule was efficient but emotionally detached, a ledger sheet rather than a legend. When he died in 161 CE, his passing was as calm as his life. No assassination, no rebellion, no scandal. His final words reportedly urged his officials to keep the equanimity, a fitting motto for an emperor who governed by balance. But history rarely pauses for long. Antoninus Pius left behind a stable empire and two adopted heirs, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. What followed was a reign marked by war, plague, and philosophy, a storm of thought and suffering that would test everything Antoninus had built. Still, his legacy remains, a rare Roman emperor who ruled not with ambition or terror, but with restraint and reason. In a world defined by expansion and spectacle, Antoninus Pius proved that sometimes the greatest act of leadership is simply holding the line. As Hadrian aged, his health declined and his paranoia grew. He became reclusive and often cruel. He appointed successors only to turn on them. Eventually, he named Antoninus Pius as his heir, but only on the condition that Antoninus would adopt two more, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. It was legacy management with all the precision of Roman engineering. Hadrian died in 138 CE. His body, initially refused burial in Rome, was later interred in what would become Castel Sant'Angelo. Even in death, he left behind a monument, not just of stone, but of an empire redefined by borders, stability, and the quiet strength of maintenance over ambition. Hadrian's legacy is one of restraint, intellect, and infrastructure. He didn't give Rome new lands, but he gave it longevity. And sometimes the greatest strength lies not in reaching further, but in knowing when to stop. The hidden complexities of the Founding Fathers, secrets behind the statues. George Washington. Calm above, turmoil within. George Washington's reputation is often that of serene composure, a man who led with restraint and quiet authority. But his closest aides recorded something more human beneath that carved marble exterior. In moments of extreme stress, especially during battlefield setbacks, Washington's temper erupted. Once, in a moment of pure frustration, he hurled his hat to the ground and cursed so vehemently that the entire camp fell silent. These were not public performances of anger, but flashes of the immense pressure he bore behind closed tents and locked doors. Washington's internal conflicts went beyond military command. He owned hundreds of enslaved people, and while he publicly expressed discomfort with slavery and freed a number of enslaved individuals in his will, his actions during his life told a more complicated story. To avoid Pennsylvania's gradual abolition laws, he strategically rotated enslaved workers in and out of state, a deliberate move to prevent their legal emancipation. The father of the nation lived with moral compromises and quiet regrets. His greatness was undeniable, but so were his contradictions. In this tension between virtue and reality lies the deeper truth of Washington, a man of exceptional leadership, wrestling constantly with the weight of his choices. John Adams, Letters, Legacy, and the War. Inside of all the Founding Fathers, John Adams may have had the sharpest mind and the most stubborn will. Fiercely intelligent, often combative, and sometimes grating, he was both the Republic's champion and its curmudgeon. But Adams's most enduring portrait isn't found in official records. It's in the 1,100 letters he exchanged with his wife, Abigail. Their correspondence is a treasure trove of emotional honesty, political analysis, and genuine partnership. Adams didn't just confide in Abigail, he relied on her insights. She advised him on foreign policy, economics, and even warned him, famously, to remember the ladies when drafting laws. In an age when women were excluded from politics, Abigail was already living in the future. Despite their strong bond, Adams was haunted by insecurity. He feared being forgotten, especially as towering figures like Washington and Jefferson claimed the nation's admiration. He fumed in retirement while Jefferson basked in the spotlight. His letters are soaked in envy and a longing for recognition. Yet he remained a man of principle. Adams was the only major founder who refused to own enslaved people, not out of political expediency, but moral conviction. It cost him support and prosperity, but it was a choice he never compromised. Imperfect, irritable, but unshakably honest, Adams left behind a legacy not of grandeur, but of gritty integrity. James Madison, the architect with a quiet heart. James Madison, known as the father of the Constitution, was a titan in a diminutive frame, standing just over 5 feet, sickly and soft-spoken. He spent much of his life in fragile health, retreating from public life during long spells of illness, possibly epileptic in nature. He was so convinced he wouldn't live long that he never wrote a memoir. Yet he helped draft the world's longest-standing democratic constitution. Madison avoided the spotlight but thrived in the shadows. While Hamilton delivered fiery speeches and Jefferson penned lyrical prose, Madison crafted the frameworks, government branches, checks and balances, the Bill of Rights. He wrote, revised, and built. His genius was infrastructural, not theatrical. His wife, Dolly Madison, added the color to his grayscale image. She was vibrant, charming and politically astute, hosting legendary gatherings that softened party rivalries. Where James shaped policy, Dolly shaped perception. Their marriage was both a partnership and a political alliance. Still, Madison bore moral ambiguity. Though personally uneasy with slavery, he owned enslaved people and never freed them, even in his will. He wrote extensively about liberty, yet failed to reconcile it with the bondage all around him. Later in life, Madison battled isolation and depression, watching his vision for limited government twist into something he no longer recognized. He had shaped the nation's foundation, but died worried that its future might undo him. He hidden truths of the Founding Fathers. George Washington, often cast in stone and myth as the epitome of stoic leadership, concealed far more than he revealed. Behind the calm exterior and powdered wig was a man who struggled with intense emotion. Though he is remembered for his cool demeanor, private aides documented sudden outbursts of rage, not in public speeches or ceremonies, but in the heat of military misfortune. One aide described a moment where Washington hurled his hat to the ground and cursed with such fury that an entire unit fell silent, stunned. These glimpses suggest that beneath the composed facade, Washington bore the weight of immense pressure, a leader balancing the burden of expectations with the chaos of reality. This duality extended into his moral life as well. Washington enslaved hundreds of people throughout his lifetime. He spoke of slavery with public discomfort and privately claimed to dislike the institution. And yet, he continued to profit from it. Though he made provisions in his will to free some enslaved people after his death, during his life, he actively avoided Pennsylvania's gradual abolition laws by rotating enslaved individuals in and out of the state, a bureaucratic loophole to maintain his labor force. He spoke of liberty while preserving bondage. In this contradiction lies the unvarnished truth of America's founding, aspirational but never fully innocent. In contrast, John Adams, the short-tempered lawyer from Massachusetts, revealed his truths not through secrecy but through paper. If Washington led with silence, Adams governed with a pen. His letters, especially those exchanged with his wife Abigail, are some of the most emotionally raw and politically revealing records of the era. Over 1,100 letters between them have survived, covering everything from constitutional theory to recipes and romantic devotion. In Abigail, Adams found a confidant and advisor. In John, she found someone who actually listened. Abigail urged him to remember the ladies when forming the new laws of the nation, an appeal for women's rights centuries ahead of its time. Adams didn't deliver on that vision, but the fact that they discussed it shows how uniquely progressive their marriage was. He respected her intellect, and she challenged his ideals. Still, Adams was a man of deep insecurity. He bristled at the reverence given to Washington and Franklin, worrying constantly about his legacy. After serving a single turbulent term as president, plagued by unpopular policies like the Alien and Sedition Acts, he watched from retirement as Jefferson was embraced as the visionary of the Republic. Adams wrote bitterly about being forgotten, yet he never wavered from his core values. He was the only founding father who refused to own slaves, even when it meant financial and political sacrifice. His stubborn honesty often made him difficult, but it also made him one of the most principled men of his age. Then there was James Madison, frail, brilliant, and quietly haunted. Known as the father of the Constitution, Madison stood just over 5 feet tall and weighed less than 100 pounds. His slight build masked an immense intellect, but also a fragile body plagued by chronic illness and fainting spells, possibly epilepsy. He believed he wouldn't live long and didn't even write a memoir. He didn't think he'd survive long enough to be remembered. And yet, he helped design the very government that still runs the country today. Madison was the silent architect of compromise, the behind-the-scenes tactician to Jefferson's eloquence and Hamilton's bravado. He authored key parts of the Federalist Papers and quietly steered debate in the Constitutional Convention. He was never loud, but he was always listening, calculating, editing. His wife, Dolly Madison, was his opposite. She was a social dynamo who charmed diplomats and domestic rivals alike. Their marriage was a masterclass in balance. She made James likable, he gave her power. Together, they turned their home into Washington, D.C.'s political nerve center. While Dolly served cakes and built alliances, Madison fine-tuned legislation and envisioned federal structure. But Madison was no saint. Like Jefferson, he was a slaveholder who intellectualized the problem but never solved it. He expressed private discomfort but took no public action to dismantle the system. His ideals were high-minded, but his practices, especially regarding slavery, were conventional and complicit. Near the end of his life, he struggled with irrelevance and watched in dismay as the small, limited federal government he had designed expanded far beyond his intentions. Still, Madison gave America the blueprint, even if it would take generations to make that blueprint serve everyone. The hidden truths of revolutionary legends. Thomas Paine wasn't born into legacy or luxury. He arrived in America at 37. A working-class Englishman with little more than a letter from Benjamin Franklin in his pocket. But in 1776, he did what few dared. He lit the fire. Common Sense, his radical pamphlet, sold over 100,000 copies, an astonishing feat for the time. In plain, searing language, Paine ridiculed monarchy, championed democracy, and argued not just for independence, but revolution. He wrote not for scholars, but for blacksmiths, farmers, and shopkeepers. His words stirred a nation. But Paine's radicalism didn't stay put. After the American Revolution, he sailed to France and embraced yet another uprising, the French Revolution. He wrote The Rights of Man, a defense of rebellion and equality. It made him a fugitive in Britain and a hero in France for a time. When Paine opposed executing King Louis XVI, the new regime turned on him. He was arrested, imprisoned, and nearly guillotined, saved only by a forgotten chalk mark on his prison door. Back in America, his star dimmed. His next work, The Age of Reason, attacked organized religion and questioned biblical authority. Though he claimed belief in God, he was branded an atheist. His former allies, even Washington, abandoned him. By the time Paine returned to the US in 1802, he was a pariah. Newspapers mocked him. He was denied the vote. He died in 1809, poor and nearly friendless. Only 6 people attended his funeral. Paine had lit the fuse of liberty, but his refusal to bend, to censor or compromise, left him burned by the very fire he helped spark. The rogue patriot, Gouverneur Morris. While the Founding Fathers carved statues in the public memory, Gouverneur Morris lived like a character out of an 18th century scandal novel. He didn't just help write the Constitution, he penned its most iconic phrase, "We the people." But outside the convention halls, Morris's life was anything but conventional. He was tall, charming, and walked with a cane. The result, some said, of a carriage accident. Others whispered it came from leaping out a jealous husband's window. Either way, Morris wore his wooden leg like a badge of defiance. In France, as a diplomat during the Revolution, Morris ignored protocol and indulged in Parisian salons and aristocratic romances. He once narrowly escaped a revolutionary mob with help from one of his many lovers. His affairs were legendary, as were the raised eyebrows they inspired. But Morris wasn't just a libertine. He was also one of the few founders to openly oppose slavery. He called it a nefarious institution and demanded federal control over it, a demand ultimately diluted in compromise. While others remained silent or complicit, Morris spoke his mind. Late in life, he shocked high society by marrying his housekeeper, Anne Carey Randolph, a woman entangled in scandal. The press erupted. Morris didn't flinch. He lived on his terms and died on them too, reportedly from a failed self-surgery involving a whalebone. In a world of powdered wigs and carefully curated images, Morris was a wild card, honest, passionate, unpredictable, and unforgettable. The double lives of American icons. The founding fathers declared liberty and built a nation on it. But the ideals they preached often clashed with the lives they lived. The greatest contradiction: slavery. Jefferson, Washington, Madison, and Monroe all owned enslaved people while championing freedom. They profited from forced labor even as they penned documents promising equality. Washington privately rotated enslaved workers out of Pennsylvania to avoid emancipation laws. Jefferson meticulously recorded the pregnancies of Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman he never acknowledged publicly, though her children bore striking resemblance to him. Some, like Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton, made gestures toward abolition, but none dismantled the system that powered their plantations, politics, and prosperity. Women, too, were excluded. Abigail Adams famously urged her husband to remember the ladies. He didn't. None of them did. The Constitution ignored half the population. Women's rights were deferred for over a century. These were not merely oversights. They were structural silences, deliberate omissions in the founding myth. For every noble ideal, there was a hidden cost. For every grand phrase, a life in chains. The Revolution promised a new world, but its architects carried old prejudices, fears, and hierarchies with them. The greatness of the founding generation is real, but so is the hypocrisy, and acknowledging both doesn't diminish them. It makes them human. The stage was theirs, but the shadows, those too were part of the design. Commodus, madness in a purple robe. Marcus Aurelius left the empire in the hands of his biological son, Commodus, a decision that historians have puzzled over for centuries. Commodus, unlike his father, had no interest in philosophy, discipline, or the burdens of wise governance. He craved applause, adoration, and spectacle. What Rome got was a theater of chaos. Crowned emperor in 180 CE, at just 18 years old, Commodus began his reign with a brief period of stability. But the calm didn't last. He quickly distanced himself from his father's advisors, surrounding himself with flatterers, sycophants, and favorites who exploited his vanity and paranoia. While Marcus had led armies and pondered duty, Commodus lounged in opulence and declared himself a living god. One of his favorite personas was Hercules, not in metaphor but in costume. He donned a lion's pelt, wielded a wooden club, and commissioned statues portraying himself as the demigod protector of Rome. More troubling than his cosplay, however, was his obsession with the arena. Commodus fancied himself a gladiator and insisted on fighting against disabled opponents or tamed animals in choreographed battles that horrified the Senate and delighted the mob. These appearances weren't just egotistical indulgences. Commodus demanded payment for his performances from the imperial treasury, draining public funds to bankroll his fantasies. He renamed months, cities, and institutions after himself. At one point, he tried to rename Rome itself, the colony of Commodus. Behind the absurdity was danger. Commodus's reign was marked by escalating cruelty and a revolving door of executions. Senators were slaughtered for imagined slights. His own sister was implicated in a plot to kill him and executed. Conspiracies bred paranoia, and paranoia bred blood. The Praetorian Guard, the very force meant to protect the emperor, became entangled in bribery, extortion, and palace intrigue. By the end of his reign, Commodus ruled through fear, spectacle, and narcissism. The philosopher's son had become a tyrant in theatrical costume, adored by the circus and loathed by the court. Finally, on New Year's Eve in 192 CE, his inner circle acted. A trusted concubine poisoned him. When that failed, a wrestler was sent to strangle him in his bath. Commodus died not as a hero, nor even a villain, but as a cautionary tale. His assassination was followed by chaos. Rome plunged into civil war, and the empire's once glorious lineage unraveled into crisis. The death of Commodus marked the end of the Pax Romana, the long Roman peace that had begun under Augustus. What followed would be a parade of short-lived emperors, backroom deals, and violent ascents. Rome, once ruled by sages and strategists, was now at the mercy of soldiers and strongmen. Commodus had inherited a legacy of reason. He left behind an empire teetering on madness. The year of the 5 emperors, chaos unleashed. With Commodus dead and no clear heir in place, the Roman Empire was left vulnerable, and ambitious generals took notice. What followed in 193 CE was a year so tumultuous that historians call it the Year of the 5 Emperors. The Senate, hoping to restore dignity, quickly declared the elderly and respected Pertinax as emperor. A seasoned administrator and former soldier, Pertinax tried to restore discipline, especially in the Praetorian Guard, who had grown decadent and corrupt under Commodus. But reforming corrupt bodyguards is never a good first move. After just 86 days in power, Pertinax was murdered by the very men who were supposed to protect him. The throne was now, shockingly, up for auction. Literally. The Praetorian Guard announced they would sell the empire to the highest bidder. Enter Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator who offered a massive bribe. Overnight, he was declared emperor, not by merit, but by money. Rome was aghast. The streets erupted in riots, and provinces refused to recognize Julianus. 3 generals, Septimius Severus, Pescennius Niger, and Clodius Albinus, each declared themselves emperor, commanding legions in the provinces and marching toward the capital. Julianus lasted only 9 weeks. Severus, the most ruthless and militarily prepared of the challengers, swept into Rome, had Julianus executed, and was recognized by the Senate. But his path to undisputed power was not yet complete. He crushed Niger in the east, and later betrayed and eliminated Albinus in Gaul. By 197 CE, Septimius Severus stood alone, emperor by blood, steel, and cunning. The year of the 5 emperors was not merely a power struggle, it marked a decisive shift. The Senate's influence waned. Military might, not lineage or statesmanship, had become the key to power in Rome. From this point forward, emperors would rise not through political consensus, but through the sword. Rome had crossed a threshold from republic-born ideals to an empire ruled by generals. And in Septimius Severus, Elagabalus, the chaos of the crowned teenager. If Commodus shocked Rome with spectacle and Severus ruled with military steel, what came next defied all sense of imperial order. In 218 CE, a 14-year-old boy named Elagabalus, born Varius Avitus Bassianus, ascended to the Roman throne. Backed by his ambitious grandmother and a legion loyal to his late cousin Caracalla, Elagabalus became emperor by civil war, not by succession or statesmanship. Elagabalus wasn't raised in the traditions of Roman leadership. He had been a high priest in Emesa, modern Syria, serving the sun god Elagabal, from whom he took his imperial name. When he came to Rome, he brought not just a foreign deity, but an entirely foreign sense of ritual, identity, and power. What followed was one of the most bizarre and tumultuous reigns in Roman history. He made Elagabal the chief god of Rome, relegating Jupiter and the Roman pantheon to secondary status. He built a lavish temple on the Palatine Hill, paraded the sacred black stone of Elagabal through the streets, and tried to force high-ranking Roman priests to adopt Eastern rites. The Senate was scandalized, the people were confused, the army was embarrassed. But religion was only the beginning. Elagabalus's behavior in private life stunned even a city used to imperial excess. Ancient sources claim he dressed in women's clothing, married both women and men, most famously a charioteer named Heracles, and sought gender reassignment surgery, a claim that, while difficult to verify, is unprecedented in Roman historical records. He threw outrageous banquets, reportedly served food made of gold, released wild animals into dining rooms as a joke, and was known to give high-ranking positions in government to his lovers. His reign was defined not by policy or war, but by scandal. The Praetorian Guard, already skeptical, grew resentful. Elagabalus alienated both the Senate and the army, two pillars no emperor could afford to offend. Even his own grandmother, who had orchestrated his rise, began to see him as a liability. In 222 CE, after 4 years of chaos, the young emperor was murdered by his own guards. His corpse was dragged through the streets, thrown into the Tiber River, and his memory was condemned by the state. Elagabalus's reign didn't just offend Roman sensibilities, it broke them. He challenged gender norms, religious traditions, and the very identity of Rome itself. Historians, then and now, struggle to separate fact from slander in the accounts of his life. Was he a dangerous eccentric? A cultural outsider crushed by Rome's intolerance? Or a flamboyant adolescent with too much power? Whatever the answer, Elagabalus stands as a symbol of what happens when absolute power is given without preparation, and when an empire's tolerance reaches its limit. His short, extraordinary reign was Rome's most flamboyant descent into absurdity, and a grim prelude to further instability. Letters, love, and the haunting mystery of Beethoven's immortal beloved. Ludwig van Beethoven, the brooding genius of classical music, lived a life marked by both immense creation and relentless isolation. But perhaps the most revealing fragments of his inner world aren't found in symphonies or concertos. They live in letters. Unsigned, unsent, and unaddressed, these emotional outpourings were discovered among his belongings after his death in 1827. They were addressed simply to his immortal beloved. The letters remain one of the greatest love mysteries in history. No name, no date, just raw, tormented declarations that baffle and captivate scholars even today. "My angel, my all, my very self," he writes. "Though still in bed, my thoughts go out to you, my immortal beloved. Oh, continue to love me. Never misjudge the most faithful heart of your beloved." These were not mere romantic scribbles. They came from a man who rarely shared his emotions. Beethoven was often prickly, curt, and at times downright hostile in correspondence. But in these letters, the mask falls. He becomes vulnerable, desperate, even unhinged. His longing is palpable, his pain almost audible in its intensity. The emotional force of the letters is amplified by the circumstances. Beethoven and this woman, whoever she was, were clearly separated, perhaps by scandal, status, or societal pressure. He writes of secrecy, obstacles, and yearning. Their love, if real, was forbidden, or at the very least, impossible. Scholars have offered many candidates. Josephine Brunswick, a widowed countess, whose letters to Beethoven reveal a deep connection. Anthony Brentano, a married aristocrat with whom he shared an intense intellectual bond. Giulietta Guicciardi, the piano student once immortalized in his Moonlight Sonata. But none of these women has been definitively proven to be the immortal beloved. What is certain is this: Beethoven loved, perhaps not often, perhaps only once, but deeply, obsessively. These letters reveal a man not of stone, but of storm, his heart no less complex than his sonatas. That he never mailed the letters adds yet another layer of melancholy. Did he lose his nerve? Was she already lost to him, by death, marriage, or betrayal? In a life filled with sound, these words are Beethoven's quietest, most private composition, and perhaps the saddest, because for all his acclaim, for all his genius, for all the grandeur of his music, he never got to be with the one woman who made his heart sing. His immortal beloved remains nameless, faceless, and lost to time, but her echoes live on, in his words, in his grief, and in every tragic chord that ever left his pen. The immortal beloved and broken hearts of genius. Not every battle that shaped history was fought with swords. Some were waged in hearts and minds. For many of the world's great figures, love was not just a passion, but a torment. Their letters, desperate, unfinished, unsent, remain the only evidence of emotions too large to live out and too painful to forget. Ludwig van Beethoven, the brooding genius of classical music, was one of the most tormented lovers in history. Though thunderous on stage and revered as a composer, in private he was fragile, even hopelessly lost. Among his belongings after his death in 1827 was a bundle of unsent letters scribbled in heartbreak and mystery. They were addressed to no one, signed by no name, dated with no year. They began simply, "My angel, my all, my very self." This woman, the so-called immortal beloved, has baffled historians for 2 centuries. Was she a married aristocrat, a widowed countess, a former piano pupil? No one knows for sure. What we do know is that Beethoven poured into her his soul. His letters cry out in longing, torment, and spiritual desperation. Though still in bed, he writes, "My thoughts go out to you, my immortal beloved. Be calm, love me, today, yesterday. What tearful longing for you, you, my life, my all." This was not a man merely in love. It was a man unraveling. The distance between them, whether literal, social, or emotional, crushed him. His longing was obsessive, his affection all-consuming. And yet, the letters were never sent. Did he lack the courage? Did the affair end before they could be read? Or had she vanished before she ever saw his words? Beethoven, whose music moved nations, could not master the movement of a single heart. He died alone, with her name unspoken, her identity a mystery still echoing through his sonatas. Oscar Wilde, the 19th century playwright with a razor-sharp tongue and flamboyant charm, was another romantic consumed by scandal, imprisoned for gross indecency due to his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, a tempestuous young aristocrat known as Bosie. Wilde penned what would become one of literature's most devastating love letters. The letter, titled De Profundis, Latin for From the Depths, wasn't short. It spanned over 50,000 words. But it wasn't just a love letter. It was a funeral dirge for Wilde's old life. From the confines of Reading jail, Wilde poured out not just betrayal and bitterness, but a kind of divine sorrow. "You came to me to learn the pleasure of life and the pleasure of art," he wrote. "Perhaps I am chosen to teach you something more wonderful, the meaning of sorrow and its beauty." Wilde was abandoned by Bosie, publicly humiliated, financially ruined. Yet in these pages, he both condemned and forgave. He accused Douglas of selfishness, yet admitted he too had been vain and blind. His agony wasn't just romantic, it was existential. The Wilde who once lit up parlors with wit had become a prisoner of both society and his own emotions. Their letters remain some of the most exquisite expressions of love between two women ever written. Woolf, often guarded and cerebral, became unexpectedly tender in Vita's presence. "I am reduced to a thing that wants Virginia," Vita wrote. "It is incredible how essential to me you have become." Their relationship, emotional, romantic, and intermittently physical, challenged every convention of early 20th century England. Vita was bold, flirtatious, and magnetic. Woolf was introspective, delicate, and fiercely brilliant. Their letters trace the shifting currents of love, at times poetic, at times playful, always honest. Their affair was never fully conventional, never fully over. Even after distance, other lovers, and personal struggles, their emotional connection endured. In a world that rarely allowed women to love freely, they found in their words a private universe. These were not ordinary love stories. They were legacies of longing, preserved not in photographs or monuments, but in letters, inked with heartbreak. Each a reminder that the world's greatest minds were also the world's most haunted hearts. These were not proclamations shouted from balconies, but quiet confessions passed between pages, coded, vulnerable, and charged with a longing that defied mere physical desire. Even after their romantic bond cooled, Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville West remained emotionally tethered, their correspondence stretching across the years until Woolf's tragic suicide in 1941. One of Woolf's final letters, addressed to her husband Leonard, is frequently quoted in biographies. Yet it is her intimate, impassioned letters to Vita that contain her rawest joys and most exposed truths. Emotions poured unfiltered onto the page. In an era that insisted on defining love in narrow, acceptable terms, Woolf and Vita authored their own unwritten rules. Their letters were not simply about love. They were love, complex, elusive, impossible to categorize. Like Woolf's own prose, their bond was fluid, tidal, always shifting. John Keats, the brilliant romantic poet behind the line, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," lived only 25 years. But his short life was an emotional odyssey, particularly in the form of letters he wrote to Fanny Brawne, the woman who consumed his heart. Their secret engagement was clouded by the looming spectre of Keats's tuberculosis. Aware that he was racing against time, Keats poured everything he had into his correspondence. In one breathtaking letter, he wrote, "I have been astonished that men could die martyrs for religion. I have shuddered at it. I shudder no more. I could be martyred for my religion. Love is my religion, and I could die for that. I could die for you." His passion bordered on worship. He called Fanny his goddess, his bright star. His need for her was so intense that it manifested as physical pain. Yet amid this adoration was fear. Fear that he'd never marry her, never hold her freely, never live long enough to deserve her. His writing is laced with tenderness and desperation. "I almost wish we were butterflies and lived but 3 summer days," he once wrote. "3 such days with you I could fill with more delight than 50 common years could ever contain." Fanny, though largely silent in public about their relationship, kept his letters for the rest of her life. When Keats died in Rome in 1821, he was buried beneath a tombstone that read simply, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." But his words didn't fade. His poetry lived on, and so did his letters, fragments of a soul unwilling to let go. Emily Dickinson, one of America's most mystifying poets, spent most of her life in seclusion, rarely venturing beyond her family home in Amherst, Massachusetts. Yet her emotional world was immense. It unfolded quietly, in poems and in letters, some sent, some hidden, some never finished. Among the most confounding of her correspondences are 3 letters addressed only to Master. Unnamed, undated, and never sent, They offer a glimpse into a love so powerful it nearly overwhelmed her. "Master, open your life wide and take me in forever," she wrote, "but I shall never be satisfied with never." Was Master a real person? Charles Wadsworth, perhaps, the married preacher she revered, or a divine ideal, a stand-in for unattainable intimacy? No one knows for sure. But the longing, the yearning in those words is undeniable. Dickinson also shared a lifelong, emotionally charged connection with her sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert Dickinson. More than 300 letters survive between them, documents pulsing with poetic flirtation and romantic overtones. "Susie, will you indeed come home next Saturday and be my own again and kiss me?" she asked. "I hope for you so much and feel so eager for you. Feel that I cannot wait. Feel that now I must have you." These weren't mere notes. They were floods of feeling, swirled in her famously slanted script. Dickinson never married. She lived quietly, buried her heart in metaphor and punctuation, and saved her truth for paper. Her letters mirror her poetry in tone and texture, aching, mysterious, intense. She loved not in silence, but in secret. And in a world that feared the full expression of women's emotions, she turned hers into art, compressed, hidden, and waiting to be discovered. Then there was Winston Churchill, whose public image was forged in wartime resolve, smoke curling from a cigar, jaw clenched in defiance. Yet the private Churchill, the one who wrote to Clementine Hozier, his wife of more than 50 years, was softer, funnier, unabashedly in love. They met in 1904 and married within months. From that point onward, letters flowed between them, even during the darkest chapters of history. While commanding troops, making speeches, and defending democracy, Churchill took time to write to Clementine. In one note he wrote, "My darling Clemmy, I hope you will forgive me for writing you such a short letter. But really I am so busy running the British Empire, I scarcely have time to keep my head on." His letters oscillated between affectionate nonsense and heartfelt gratitude. He often credited her with grounding him, calling her his darling cat, and celebrating her intellect as much as her devotion. In return, Clementine was his fiercest supporter and his occasional critic, an anchor in his stormiest moments. She offered counsel on politics, soothed his ego when battles were lost, and never let him forget that even lions need love. Their love story wasn't filled with grand romantic gestures or scandal. It endured through quiet strength, through pages exchanged in the face of war and distance. It was a reminder that even those who carry nations on their shoulders still need someone to write home to. The year of the 5 emperors, chaos unleashed with Commodus gone and no heir in place, Rome became a prize to be claimed. In 193 CE, 5 men would wear the purple, but only one would survive. First came Pertinax, a seasoned and disciplined senator the Senate hoped would restore order. But Pertinax's reforms, especially his attempts to rein in the bloated, corrupt Praetorian Guard, cost him dearly. After just 86 days, they murdered him in his palace. Then came one of Rome's most surreal moments. The Praetorian Guard auctioned off the empire. Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, bought the throne. It was a brazen act of political prostitution, and it sent shockwaves through the empire. The people rioted, provinces rebelled, Rome's military elite revolted. 3 generals declared themselves emperor: Septimius Severus, Pescennius Niger, and Clodius Albinus. Each commanded legions and claimed legitimacy. But it was Severus, brilliant and ruthless, who acted swiftly. He marched on Rome, executed Julianus, and secured Senate approval. But Severus's war wasn't over. He crushed Niger in the east, then turned on Albinus in Gaul. By 197 CE, he stood alone. not chosen by senate or gods, but by sword and blood. The year of the 5 emperors was more than political chaos. It marked a shift in Rome's foundation. Gone was the illusion of a republic. Power now belonged to whoever could seize it by force. The army, not the Senate, made emperors. In Severus, Rome had a new template, the military autocrat, unyielding and pragmatic. The imperial purple no longer symbolized civic virtue. It was war paint, Commodus, madness in a purple robe. Marcus Aurelius entrusted the Roman Empire to his biological son, Commodus, a decision historians still debate with equal parts disbelief and fascination. While Marcus was the embodiment of Stoic philosophy, governance, and duty, Commodus was his polar opposite, theatrical, indulgent, and dangerously erratic. Ascending to the throne in 180 CE at just 18, Commodus began with a veneer of stability. But soon he dismantled his father's legacy, discarding wise counsel for the flattery of sycophants. While Marcus meditated on justice and virtue, Commodus declared himself a god on earth, demanding worship and reveling in the spectacle. Commodus fancied himself Hercules incarnate. He wore lion skins, wielded a wooden club, and commissioned statues that immortalized this delusion. But it was his obsession with gladiatorial combat that truly stunned Rome. He fought in the Colosseum, always against disabled opponents or wild animals weakened beforehand, and demanded payment from the public coffers for these bloody performances. It wasn't heroism, it was self-glorification under the guise of entertainment. He renamed months after himself, even attempted to rename Rome the colony of Commodus. His narcissism knew no bounds, but behind the absurdity lurked real danger. His rule became a cycle of purges, conspiracies, and paranoia. The Senate lived in fear. Even his own sister, implicated in a plot, was executed. The Praetorian Guard, tasked with protecting the emperor, became pawns in Commodus's internal chaos, succumbing to bribery and backstabbing. By the end, Rome was a city under siege, not from enemies, but from its own ruler's madness. On December 31st, 192 CE, those closest to him finally acted. Poison failed, so they sent a wrestler to strangle him in his bath. With his death, the empire teetered. The Pax Romana, the long peace that had begun under Augustus, ended with Commodus's last breath. Civil war and imperial chaos followed. What Marcus Aurelius had spent a lifetime building was undone by a son who ruled in costume and delusion. Churchill and Clementine, Love in Wartime, Inc. Winston Churchill is often remembered for his iron will, his stirring wartime speeches, and his bulldog tenacity. But behind that unshakable facade was a man deeply tethered to one woman, Clementine Hozier, his wife of over 50 years. Their love story wasn't loud or showy. It lived quietly in the lines of letters exchanged across continents and decades. Churchill nicknamed Clementine Cat, and she called him Pug, affectionate code that echoed in their correspondence. Their notes weren't merely marital updates, they were a refuge, an anchor amid history's storms. Even during the chaos of World War II, Churchill made time to write her, often using wit to soften the weight of global leadership. "Forgive the short letter," he once wrote, "but I'm terribly busy running the British Empire." Their exchanges could be playful or poignant, but they also held space for correction. In 1940, Clementine gently wrote to Winston, cautioning him about his temper toward staff. It wasn't rebuke, it was care. Her honesty helped him steer a nation without losing his humanity. And he listened. Even late in life, Churchill would scribble short, affectionate notes to her. Their bond was forged in war, yes, but also in friendship, respect, and devotion that never wavered. Behind the speeches and statecraft, his truest piece often came from a letter, folded quietly and addressed to Clementine. Zelda and F. Scott Fitzgerald, A Jazz Age Inferno. Zelda and F. Scott Fitzgerald were the darlings of the Jazz Age, wild, brilliant, doomed. Their love story played out like one of Scott's novels, glamorous on the surface, but unraveling underneath. It began with letters, as so many romances do. Scott, then a young army officer, wrote to Zelda with the desperation of a man who needed her to believe in his future. "I've loved you since the first moment," he declared. She hesitated, but once his first novel succeeded, she married him. Their letters are snapshots of a love too bright to last. Zelda once wrote, "I've just washed my hair and I can't do a thing with it, but I love you madly." Scott adored her, but feared her independence. When she tried to write or dance, he undercut her ambitions, insisting there could only be one creative voice in the marriage. As fame gave way to alcoholism and collapse, their letters grew darker. Zelda wrote from sanitariums. Scott replied from hotel rooms. Still, the tenderness lingered. "Words aren't right," she once wrote. "They just aren't." Scott died in 1940, thinking he'd failed. Zelda followed 8 years later, dying in a fire at her hospital. But their letters remain, mad, luminous, fragmented, a monument to a love as volatile as the decade that made them.